All right, everybody, let's talk about the five major areas of screenplays. Now, in lesson two, you had formatting a screenplay, and in lesson one, you had several sections in your book, particularly the 402 to 409, I believe, section in your book that was talking about formatting a screenplay and how it all works together. I've shown you examples of screenplays. But let's get into the nitty-gritty and talk about exactly what each of the five elements does, what their purposes are, and how to use them. And then I'll give you an example that I've written up myself. Okay, going to lesson two, we're going to run down the five major elements and what they actually do real quick. They're not hard, but you have to understand that while you have a tremendous amount of freedom in screenplay writing, um, basically we have some very broad guidelines that everyone is just basically expected to follow. Within those broad guidelines, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want to. But from formatting perspective, each one of these five simple areas has to be done in a very specific way so that you understand exactly what is going on screen. It helps you visualize what's happening. So let's go ahead and jump into these. Now, the five major areas are slug line, action, character name, dialogue, and parentheticals. Okay? Now, these all have their own formatting. Now, this is very important that you understand that the formatting on a page actually matters quite a bit here. This is not something that you can mail in. This is not something that you can disregard. The formatting on the page actually tells the audience, the reader, sorry, the reader, not the audience, tells the reader exactly what type of element this is. It differentiates action from dialogue. Okay, so where it is positioned on the page tells the reader what type of element this is. Whether it is in all caps or not will tell the reader what type of dialogue or what type of information this is. So for example, a slug line sets the scene. This is where it always starts. Every time we go to a new scene, if you picture in a show, every time we cut from inside to outside, from one location to another location. If your characters were on the street and now they're in a building, or they were on First Street, now they're on Second Street. They were on the street and now they're in a cab. These require different slug lines because they are in different scenes. Any time that your story goes from one location, one setting to another setting, you need another slug line. Now, even if you're jumping back and forth between two scenes, each time you put another slug line to let people know this scene is happening here, this scene is happening there. Okay, so this happens every single time. Now, slug lines are always in all caps, and they're always left aligned. In other words, they're always against the left side of the page, and they're always in all caps. We don't have to write them out in full form. They basically go like this, either internal or external. So, for example, are we inside or outside? Give me a very brief description of where we are. And when I say description, not raining or snowing or any of that jazz, just New York City street is the one that I've given you in this example. Or, you know, SFA TV2 studio, like I'm in right now. That's fine. That's enough to tell me what's going on and to refer back to at other points in the script. Anytime I say SFA TV2 Studio, I know where I'm supposed to be. And then if it matters, we can say the time of day. Daytime, nighttime. We probably don't necessarily need like 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., that kind of thing. We probably don't need that specific, but if it matters if it's day or night in the scene, then we can put that in as well. But that's it. Very brief, very specific, okay? And that goes. Then we give ourselves a couple of returns. In other words, we space things out. And we go in with what is called an action. Now, anytime we need to describe significant changes of action or significant specific actions that our characters are taking, we put in an action. But we also put in an action at the very beginning of every single new scene. At the beginning of every single new scene. This sets the scene and lets people know exactly what is happening in that scene. So, for example, if we are external, New York City street, day, we might say something like, there is a hustle and bustle of people moving up and down the street. The sun beats down on the people. Uh, many of the uh, many of the passerbys are sweating and wiping their brows. Um, Kids are laughing and playing in a fire hydrant spout. And then I might give a character name and say, gets out of a cab, right? And that's enough to let me know what is happening on that scene. What's happening as we begin this scene. So that's an action. That begins us, or that starts every scene. And then we can come back and add another action anytime that we need to change the audience's, or change rather the character's major actions within the scene. Now, here's the caveat. If we open a scene and say we have Jill making a cake, it's enough to say Jill is making a cake and leave it there. We don't have to later on put um, Jill picks up the box of flour and pours it into the bowl. Jill begins whisking the ingredients in the bowl. Jill cracks an egg. Unless she cracks an egg in a very aggressive manner at a point during the script, we don't have to go back in and basically telegraph every single action that the actor takes throughout the scene. We don't have to do that. If she is if she or he has a progressive, persistent action that she is taking, making a cake or mixing ingredients or something like that, playing video games, we leave the rest of that up to the actor's interpretation. We don't have to do everything. I'm giving you an example of Quentin Tarantino's writing style, I think at the end of this, of Module 1. Quentin Tarantino does telegraph every single move that a character makes, but he's one of the very, very few people that does that in screenplays because it can take like 22 pages to script like a single interaction between two characters, or in his case, a fight scene between several of the characters. It's kind of crazy, but it's Quentin Tarantino. He does what he does. So, major actions, or you use an action when you set a scene, and then you use an action when you change what characters are up to. So if a character needs to do something at a particular time, that's when you go ahead and put another action in there. Okay? Want to make something clear with the action. I know I'm spending a lot of time, but this is something that a lot of students have an issue with when they're getting into this. Actions are not for setting characteristics of characters. In other words, you do not tell me that that Tex had a dark childhood and is struggling with depression in your action. When you set the scene, you do not do that. You reveal this stuff through what Tex does and how Tex interacts with other characters, what Tex says. So through my story, you might make it clear through what he says to the other characters that he is struggling with depression. Maybe he's got a drinking problem, and then you reveal through the story that it's because of the depression that he's struggling with. But you don't put that in the action. The action is exactly what is happening on screen at the time, what the viewer can see and hear. Smell, touch, none of this actually matters. It's seen and hearing. Okay? I'm going to move on from there. All right, character name comes next. These are usually centered and they're usually in all caps. That's pretty straightforward. If you need someone to be off screen, you would put in parentheses next to them OS. If they are just a voiceover, for example, if someone is doing internal or external narration, then you would put a VO next to them. Okay, so if I had a narrator, for example, I could put narrator. They don't appear anywhere in the story at all. So next to the narrator, I would put open parentheses VO. Okay, if I have someone say, like in Goodfellas, if you've ever seen that, the main character talks about what it was like to be a gangster, but he provides internal narration. Well, I could put his name and then VO, and then he talks about that. Okay, so centered, all caps. The next would be the dialogue. Now here's where things get interesting. Action is always left aligned. Okay? Dialogue is not centered. This is a thing that people have an issue with. A lot of folks see how many screenplays are formatted and they think what they're seeing is that it's centered. It's not. It's actually just indented a couple of lines, or rather it's pushed to the right. Now, I'm going to show you in just a second how this works. But essentially what you're doing is just moving the line over a couple of spaces and then lining everything up on a new left align. I'll get to that in a second. Dialogue is exactly what your characters are saying. Okay? Now, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to follow strict grammatical rules, just like we don't follow strict grammatical rules. You can use ain'ts and curses and things like this, but remember you are making this for general television audience, so kind of keep that in mind when you're writing. Parentheticals. This is where things get interesting. Parentheticals basically fall into two categories. They are how your character is saying something. So for example, if they have a particular accent or they put on an air for a particular type of piece of dialogue, or if there is one very specific thing they do at a very, very specific part of a dialogue or a piece of dialogue, this is where you put this in. This is sort of like a break in their dialogue or stage description that you provide for your actors on the fly. Okay? This is awkward, but hopefully I can explain this more as we go. Let me show you the example that I've made. So, this is a very brief example that I wrote. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so I wrote a Star Wars piece. Okay, I've got a couple of problems with this. I wrote it pretty quickly using actually a script writing program and then converted it to my Word document, which was easy enough. So I've got a couple of issues. For example, here we have our slug line. The problem with the slug line right now is that the whole thing needs to be in all caps. So I can go here, font, and all caps. There we go. That is a quality slug line. And I'll create a space there. So, exterior, asteroid field. An enormous asteroid rolls and tumbles through space. A lone X-wing darts through the field, its S-foils closed. The fighter rolls lazily over an asteroid while locking S-foils in attack position. Upon completing the roll, the fighter kicks in all four engines and rockets deeper into the asteroid field. Now, with increased nimbleness, the fighter dances between smaller asteroids as they roll and crash in its wake. Executing precision maneuvers, the fighter rolls through a hole in a large asteroid only to find itself heading directly into the path of three smaller asteroids moving toward each other. The fighter looses volley after volley of scarlet quad laser fire into asteroids, vaporizing them as it bursts through the remaining debris and out of the asteroid field. So, this is pure description of exactly what is going on screen at the time. This is an action. This is what we see on screen. It's what we hear on screen, okay? Next, we jump to the next part, interior, X-Wing. So, we've started with exterior, we go to interior. Dax Shum. This will be a character. It's all caps, Dax Shum. A dark-skinned man with a round face and blue eyes sits behind a pilot seat adjusting knobs on a control yoke. His astromech droid, YUL-3, called Yule, again all caps, sits behind the cockpit spinning its dome-like head. Again, what we see, what we hear, it's in action. Jump down to the middle. Dax Shum, what does he do very specifically? He whoops loudly, woohoo! That's what I'm talking about. Nothing like starting a day with a quick run through the rock yard. Now, take a look at what we've got with the dialogue. So, this, and I'm going to take out the formatting for a second. Okay, this is dialogue. If I were to center this, notice how it doesn't do much. It just jumps over. I want to make it very clear, and I want to make sure it lines up with all the rest of my dialogue. What I do with this is actually hit my paragraph indent, just like that. Now, if I were to continue to type, it always continues to jump back down to that same indent again and again and again. Okay? All right, I continue on. Yule. He has no actual dialogue, but he beeps and whistles doubtfully. Go back to Dax. Oh, come on, Yule. Live a little. You're starting to remind me of Old Lady Ferris. Mechanical grunts. Dax. Mocking a female, prim and proper. Or mocking female, prim and proper. Again, parenthetical. How Dax is actually going to say this. Mr. Shum. You are a Corsair officer, and I am not your mother. Okay? So, parenthetical. Again, tells me how my character is supposed to say this thing, and then my dialogue is what my character is actually saying. Yule mocks the mockingly tweets. Dax continues mocking. So, calls back to the parenthetical I had earlier. And do something about that rolling trash can you call him astromech. Yule, grumpy mechanical grunts. Dax, chuckles. Yeah, well, I miss her too. Yeah, I miss her too. Well, I guess that's probably enough playing around for today. Set course back to base and let them know we're coming home. Okay? So, that's all these different pieces working together. So, we've got slugs. We've got actions, we've got our characters, we've got parentheticals, and we've got dialogue. Everything that goes into a basic piece, and in this case, sort of a dialogue, sort of, and that's how they all work together. I hope this clarifies. If it doesn't, as always, get in touch with me and let me know. And I'd love to work with you a little bit more and talk with you about how to make that happen. I started off writing these things in Microsoft Word. There are plenty of other programs that you can use for this. I've used Adobe's Story Maker before. I think, given you links in some of the videos to some other script writing programs. But I would suggest you'd be fine with Microsoft Word. It's not hard to do the formatting. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to talk with you. Good luck, and look forward to seeing your Storymatic ones. Bye.